Let's talk about why, if someone is not a type 1 diabetic, and you may be asking this question, if I'm not a type 1 diabetic, or if I have a friend or cousin or aunt or uncle or mom, brother, sister, kid, if they are not type 1, which is an insulin requirement, they have to have insulin, and a person is type 2, why then does that person use insulin? Because we've been saying all along that your body actually is probably producing more insulin than a person who is non-diabetic. And the reason that we give people insulin is because the body, the things that they're doing, whether it's oral medication, exercise, eating, sleeping, drinking water, right? So all the things that we've talked about, the lifestyle things, at that time don't seem to be working. And so we still have to get the blood sugar down. And we know that if we put somebody on insulin, we're bringing the blood sugar down. That's what insulin does. All right? So if you are a type 2 diabetic, and I check your insulin, and your insulin is higher than a person who doesn't have diabetes, and the blood sugar is still high, despite the other things we're doing, insulin is where we go. Right? Because we want to bring that blood sugar down. In fact, when someone walks into my office, and usually, right, not in 100% of the cases, usually when someone shows up in my office, they show up in my office because they and their physician, their medical providers, they have been trying a bunch of things to try to get the blood sugars down, and they've been unsuccessful. And so they show up in my office. And we have a discussion. People show up with A1Cs that are, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Right? In our office, our A1C machine, the highest it will say is greater than 14. Now, if you go to the lab and you have blood drawn, they will sometimes give you a number, 15, 16, 17, 21. So when someone shows up with blood sugar, with A1C that high, right, that means that their blood sugars have been running high as well. And so in that instance, when they show up, this is not the time for saying, hey, I want you to go home and exercise. I want you to go home and I want you to, drink more water. I want you to go. Right. Now, we talk about that. As a matter of fact, we do an entire discussion about lifestyle modification, because that's where I want you to go. That's where I want you to be. That's where you need to be. But right now, this moment, you need some insulin to get that blood sugar down. Okay? So remember that as you are talking and as you're talking to your healthcare provider, my goal is always the best blood sugar on as little medication as possible, right? So that's always the goal. And specifically for my type 2 diabetics, my goal is always as little insulin as possible, because I know all the things that insulin does. Okay. All right. So different types of insulin. So basal insulin, bolus insulin, and we'll go through those here as we get into discussion. Other types of insulin, right? So the thing that everybody is afraid of, or a thing that everybody talks about, is this injection that they have to do, right? So insulin, if you don't know, insulin is an injectable medication. People sometimes are afraid of the injection. It's a subcutaneous needle, subcutaneous insulin, that's where it goes. And it's absorbed under the skin, right? So under the skin, there are those fat cells that are there. And when you inject the insulin in that tissue, within the fat, then there are blood vessels, very small blood vessels that run through the fat. And those blood vessels absorb the insulin from the subcutaneous tissue, and that gets into the blood. And then in the blood, it goes and it does all the things that insulin does. One of the challenges that we will sometimes see is a patient who is very slim, right? They don't have a lot of subcutaneous tissue. And we see that a lot for patients who are type 1, right? Because typically they're very small, they're thin, they don't have a lot of subcutaneous fat. And so remember, insulin works because there's subcutaneous fat. So if you're just all muscle, that sometimes gets to be a challenge. And you can imagine, right? So here's one of the trade issues. So you have a patient who is a type 1 diabetic who requires, and they have to have insulin. They're type 1. And they are like exercising fanatics. They're really healthy, they eat well. And so you look at them and you're looking on the body to try to find some place where they can inject the insulin. And we tell them on the stomach and the back of the arm, on the upper outer thigh, on the back of upper buttock cheeks. And you're looking and you're like, man, there's not a whole lot of fat there. And so sometimes that's a challenge, because as they are taking insulin, it may not absorb as efficiently as we may need. All right? So that's something that we don't often talk about, but it's something that does happen. One of the things with insulin therapy is we tell patients that they should rotate their site. Rotate their site. Because what happens is as you're injecting in the insulin, you're doing some trauma to that tissue, right? So you're sticking a needle in the tissue. And if you keep doing the same spot every time, then that spot becomes it becomes hard. And so now you go to inject, and a lot of people say, oh, I inject it right there because it doesn't hurt. Well, the reason it doesn't hurt anymore is because you've been using that same spot all the time. But after a while, that spot under the skin becomes hard, and you can't, when you inject it, the insulin doesn't get absorbed, right? It's called lipodystrophy. Lipodystrophy, the term that we use